So anybody else feel free to weigh in who would like. I think as I was listening to your conversation, I'm struck by a couple of things. One, I'm intrigued by how some of this continued to spill over even into the early church, because this attitude of rightness and making sure that rules trump, this action, or purity trumps that action. And because we know that Jewish believers and Gentile believers still continued to fuss and fight, right? Over things like circumcision and things like that.
Yeah, well, they were kind of kicked out for a while by the Roman emperor. And then when they were allowed to come back in, then the Gentiles had been there for a while. The Jews got kicked out. Now it's like, well, now that they come back, who's in charge here?
Yeah, exactly.
But that's a very foundational thing for Galatians is how do we live together? So Paul goes into this very ornate imagery for Sinai and how Sinai represents the mountain of God, and what's the other mountain he uses? I can't remember. But he contrasts Sarah and Hagar, so it's very interesting. But it's like the dealing with the Jews and Gentiles coming together. What not only that was that difficult, that was to the regions that were Jews and Gentile, but just to the Romans, it was a complete, which I think is happening in Mary and Martha too. It's a complete blowing up of the social structure, or at least not a blowing up of it. It's putting a time bomb beside it. And that is hard for us to deal with sometimes, but that is how the Bible deals with stuff. Is why did God not tell Paul to get rid of slavery? He didn't, but he put a time bomb beside it, because slavery and the gospel can't exist together for too long. One of them will be squashed out, and we know it's not going to be the gospel. And so he put the time bomb beside it, and that's what Philemon's about. It's you have to live with your neighbor in a loving and understanding way. Eventually they'll see there is no way to do that if you're enslaving them. And so the first step to that was, okay, keep them as bondservants, but treat them as you would a brother, which is what Philemon says, which is unheard of. You can't even eat a plate until they've put it down and they're not touching it anymore. It's like you cannot serve them if they're your bondservant. And so he says, treat them like you would a brother. It's putting a time bomb beside the institution of slavery, and that's the same thing for a lot of things. But the Roman thing is, there's no Jew or Gentile, Greek, barbarian, slave. All of that is male or female. It's all of the hierarchy in the Roman system was completely going to be destroyed under the gospel. It cannot exist.
That's great. You're exactly right. And I think about today. I think about where it's so fascinating to me that we have so many different denominations. We have so many different approaches to God, so many people who are going to draw lines in the sand and say, I'm right and I'm wrong. However, if you came upon a car accident scene, you wouldn't do an inventory of someone's religiosity. You wouldn't, you would get out and I got to think, even as we're growing kind of more apart from God or drifting, as I guess in many ways, most people are still going to stop. Most people are still going to offer help. Yeah. Yet in the context of the body of Christ, it's like, oh, I disagree with you, I'm out. So it's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating how that, I don't know. I'm not even really sure what to do with that. But that just came to me as I was listening to you talk, and, God have mercy on us when we're not brotherly or sisterly or kind or honor life or whatever
and that's
the word might be.
I think in our time, we don't have a problem loving Samaritans because they're not near us. Although there are still some of them in the Middle East, and they actually practice the Mosaic sacrificial system, and they have like a high priest and all that. But that's not our problem. And I just, it's hard to think about what you could substitute that for. And I think this may be controversial, but I think for some people you could substitute in that parable Samaritan with a Republican or Democrat, and you'd feel the same way. As I would never help them. They believe in this, or they believe in that, or they support this, or they support that. I cannot agree with them. And he didn't ask the guy to agree with the Samaritan. He asked him to help him because he's dying, or help him because he's his neighbor, and to acknowledge that he's his neighbor first. So and whatever makes your stomach turn is the point of the parable, and that's gets into a different headspace. We have to, because in our mind, we're not allowed to dislike people and stuff like that, but it's okay to admit you dislike people as long as you're willing to work through that and love them. But,
and Tyler and I were visiting on Monday, and we were chatting about this a little bit, that, our media and various types and forms of media, what was the phrase we used? It used to be that sex sells, now fear sells.
Anger. Hating your neighbor sells.
Neighbor sells. And it's a tragedy. I mean, it's just,
everything's prefaced with someone's political ideology and race and gender.
Yeah.
It's like nothing is just a statement now. It's something that will make you either side with someone in your camp or hate someone in the other camp. It has to preface that. So now it was sex sells. Now it's anger and hating your neighbor sells.
Yeah.
Because it makes you feel good when you're part of a tribe, and part of that is excluding people.
Yeah. Okay, so I have there's a statement here. I tell my kids, if you're hanging out on a cliff and about to fall, you're not going to worry about who saves you. Yeah, that's
never
great.
mind. The Samaritan was gonna, if you're hanging on by your fingers, there to come step on your hand and
Right,
make sure you fall.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
and
what
we may feel some of that about certain folks too, but that's the timeliness of the message is spot on and powerful. So thank you guys. Hey, any questions about or observations about what Tyler just shared so far? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, Greg.
Yes.
Yeah, Greg. This is David. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We got you.
I missed last time, and I'm sorry. I'm wondering your analogy of the two priests, the first two passerbys of the hurt man. Is that what actually was their mindset, or are you supposing that could have been some of the reason why they didn't stop and administer aid?
Yeah. Did you hear the question?
Was that their mindset?
Was that their mindset, or are we making just a supposition that?
Oh, well, I don't know their mindset, but I do know their interpretation, and that is kind of the way it's been typically preached is, well, let's see who's the good guy, and so that's why it's be like a good Samaritan, because he was the good guy. When Jesus' whole frame was, let's see how to interpret Scripture. Who interprets it wrongly? Okay, well, the priests and Levites interpret it like this.
Okay.
And Samaritan interprets like this. So let's see how we should interpret it. And so it would have been shocking that a Samaritan interpreted it correctly.
Leviticus 21.
Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
So that's a good question. I don't know what their mindset was, but it's not necessarily that they were dirty, rotten old priests and they hated this guy and they were just so enslaved to their religiosity they couldn't even help their neighbor. It's not that. It's just that they may have wanted to help, they just couldn't. Same way that if it was Sabbath, it very well could have been it was Sabbath and he was walking, as long as it's not over a certain amount of steps. So someone's neighbor their donkey was in a hole and they said, I can't help you. I cannot break Sabbath. And it's like I can help you right when the sun goes down, because that's when Sabbath ends, but I cannot help you right now. I don't think their intention was, I hate you, therefore I will not help you in the name of keeping Sabbath. I think it is, I want to help you, I just can't. Although when we get to Jerusalem, the priests and Sadducees are not viewed in a great light. But so.
Okay. All right. What I'd like to do now is read just this brief section here on the visit to Martha's house, Martha and Mary's house. We can certainly come back and talk about more of what we just covered. So just because we're moving forward doesn't mean we have to not take a step back at all. As Jesus and his disciples, and I'm in Luke chapter 10, beginning at verse 38. As Jesus and his disciples were on their way, he came to a village where a woman named Martha opened her home to him. She had a sister called Mary who sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. But Martha was distracted by all the preparations that had been made. She came to him and asked, Lord, don't you care that my sister has left me to do the work by myself? Tell her to help me. And this is where I so wish I had an audio recording of Jesus's response, because I would love to know the tone in his voice as he replied to her. But he said, Martha, Martha, you are worried and upset about many things, but few things are needed, or indeed only one. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. So we shared a little bit of background information via the handouts, and I'm not going to spend much time there tonight because I'm interested to see what Tyler and Jaina have to say about this text. I just tried to point out some things that got my attention as I read through various sources. I'm always intrigued by opposites in Luke because there's just so many of them, or comparisons and contrasts. We're going to see a few episodes around this context that I think showcase why this is placed where it is. But I don't want to get in too much of that. I'm going to let these guys share some of their thoughts, and then I want to come back and highlight just a handful of things in the handout if we have time to do that. But so guys, go ahead and share whatever's on your mind with this little section here.
I struggle with this section because it is, and it's a bully text is what I call them, is it's used to bully people sometimes, obviously not all the time, but it's used to prove a point or to take a stance or to make an assertion that it was never intended to. So that's why I get a little bit hesitant about it sometimes, but it's also, it gets kind of spiritualized very quickly in terms of, very quickly this can turn into, why you're on your phone too much instead of praying. Well, that is certainly maybe an application, but it's, I think first, I guess this is just my brain that processes things first in a cultural light is, this is a very radical teaching in Jesus' time. For us, it may not be. It's just telling her, hey, calm down. She'll help you in a minute. I don't think that was his point there. But his point is that it says she wanted to sit at his feet, or she went to sit at his feet, which is a very technical expression, a Hebrew expression in Jesus' time for being at the feet of and under the authority of the rabbi. I mean, you're a formal student of him, which was unheard of in Jesus' time for a woman to do that. And so in one sense, he permits that, but in another sense, it's not that she, it's not that she was very meek and nice and, hey, can I join? It wasn't that. I think it's that she boldly forced her way into it and invited herself into there. And it says she chose the good portion. She chose this. She came in here and she sat down with us, and she chose the good portion, which is sitting at the rabbi's feet, which is a expression for just learning from him, which was a male thing at Jesus' time. And so I think that is a huge blowing up of the social order that a woman would be at the feet of a rabbi and learning from him. So that is huge, because that is opening the door to so much. I mean, what women did not study, it kind of gets overplayed how poorly women were treated in the first century. I think it gets kind of hyped up for sermons and stuff. We kind of treat them like we treat the first century as if they treated women like they were dogs, and that wasn't really the case. It was just it was a patriarchal society, and that didn't mean your life was miserable. It just meant most likely you stayed at home and you didn't go farm. You stayed at home with children and you cooked and you cleaned and you prepared dinner, stuff like that. I mean, you know what a patriarchal society is. You what? Oh, yeah. And as a mother, I mean, you were expected to memorize. I mean, women would not follow rabbis, but they were expected to know Leviticus. They would generally memorize that in their youth, because how are you going to keep a household kosher and pure if you don't know Leviticus? So they memorize Leviticus, they memorize Proverbs, because it's expected for the women to have wisdom. And women are almost always portrayed as having more wisdom than men, because wisdom itself is personified as a woman in Proverbs, but just in writings from Jesus' time, women were they just understood that, I say that, but understood that women were wiser, whether you agree with that or not, but they just believed that and understood it, that they thought women were wiser. And so it gets played up a little bit how poorly women were treated, but it is true that that was a man's space, in the same sense that if you were a woman and you just invited yourself to a men's conference because you liked the speaker, says, well, I want to hear from him too. I don't care if it's a men's only convention. I'm going because I want to hear from him. Well, it takes a lot of guts to do that. And people may not push you away, but it's breaking a few cultural assumptions. And even more so, it would be like if I come to stay the night at your house and I just, grab a pillow and come and sleep on the floor of your room that night. It's like there's designated spaces in the home, and you just understand not to cross over. And so the fact that she's at Jesus' feet is crossing over to a different space she was not supposed to be in, which is why I struggle with this text, because I'm failing to see Martha's point, because she's like, I am serving, and she is not really supposed to be in there. She's supposed to be with me. And so he tells her to, Martha, Martha, which is a term of expression, which is in kind of putting more importance on it. Like when Absalom dies and David says, Absalom, Absalom, my son, it's exclaiming kind of more heavily, or just in just regular terms. It's like even for nouns, like there's a part, and I can't remember where, maybe Judges, where people fall into it says a great pit, but the Hebrew says they fell into a pit. It's just, they fell into a big pit. So they fell into a pit, a big pit, or more importantly, my God, why have you forsaken me? It's very, very expressive. And so Martha is very expressive. I don't know what Tony would have said it in. That's why I would have too. But there's one thing that may help, because first of all, the story seems so out of place, at least to me. And I've struggled to put it in the place of the narrative. And maybe I've said this before, but I think Luke has used from chapter 10, where it says he set his face to go to Jerusalem, which is called the travelogue, generally from that to Jerusalem. He kind of uses it as a bucket to just throw Jesus' teachings in, which is okay because he's mimicking Moses in that way, that their journeys to the promised land, it was kind of narrative mixed with teaching, mixed with narrative. And it's not that they were walking around and then Moses stopped all of Israel and then gave the teachings that are in Numbers and then we packed up and moved along. That's not the point. But that's just how Numbers is kind of structured. So Luke is structured that way too. But this one, it is suggested, I can give you a theory just because this is a class, but it's just a good idea or theory that I like, that this was part of a much bigger section. And Luke uses it, either you could say uses it in a different way or didn't know that it was part of the bigger section. So it gets broken up. And that may freak you out a little bit, but in a sense you have to do that because there are just things in the Gospels that seem out of order because the writers are using them in different ways or reordering them in different ways. Like in one instance where Jesus is set in Nazareth, I think in Matthew, he calls the disciples and then, he has the synagogue in Nazareth happening and then calls the disciples. But in Luke, he calls the disciples, then has the synagogue in Nazareth happening. And you got to decide, okay, or is one of them lying, or is Luke using it in a different way to show how Moses assembled the 12 tribes and then kind of gave the mission statement of God? So I think it's more that. And that's the same thing with Luke, I think from here to Jerusalem is kind of a big bucket of teaching that sometimes, of course, some of them are connected, but he doesn't, all that to say, sorry, I don't want to get too offbeat, but I think this is part of later in Luke in the kind of anxiety teachings. And it fits in really, really well, I think, at least, it's not my work. It's a Robert Lindsay, a scholar. Because there's a ton of similar vocabulary. They're worried about many things and troubled. And then he thinks that it fits right in before he starts teaching the disciples about, I tell you, do not be worried. He's talking to Mary, and it says, then he told his disciples, after seeing Mary worried and anxious, I tell you, do not be worried about your life, literally your soul. What will you have to eat and drink, nor about your body, what you will have to wear? Isn't your soul more than food, or the body more than clothes? And it just goes into the birds, looking at the birds, how they don't sow or reap, or the birds don't store in granaries. And then he goes into a story about a man who stored up wealth in his granaries. And then he talks about the lilies of the field and how they're not clothed a certain way, how they don't toil or spin and they don't worry. And it's all worries scattered all throughout it. So the lilies of the field do not worry, how they're clothed. And then he tells a story about a rich man in Lazarus where the rich man is clothed in purple and fine linen. So he's clothed really nicely. And then there's a poor guy who is Lazarus. And it's interesting narrative. I think it fits in very well. Makes a whole lot more sense to me because Jesus uses his opportunity to teach his disciples about anxiety and worry. And I can't prove that, but it fits in really well. The vocabulary is, soul in granaries and goods, and worry is in anxiety is kind of scattered all throughout it as just one big teaching. The same way that lost sheep, lost coin, lost son is. It's clearly one common theme in multiple sets of teachings. And that is how rabbis taught, and that's how usually Jesus teaches until it gets kind of broken up and used in different ways. Which is same thing with you use 2 or 3 parables to prove one point, because remember the Torah on the account of 2 or 3 witnesses, something should be judged to be true. And so they use 2 or 3 parables to show what I say is I'm judging it true from God. God is saying this is to be true. At least that was their point. And so it's he tells 2 or 3 sections on anxiety and worry, which I think is so helpful for us because I think a huge problem with understanding anxiety and worry is that it seems like Jesus teaching on anxiety, worry is do not worry, or do not be anxious. Like that seems like his extent on anxiety and worry when it's a whole lot deeper than that. It's going into what causes worry and how to kind of alleviate that. But
I think it also shows in the Lucan narrative, like in Acts, how Stephen can die the way that he does, how Paul, can be in prison and be singing and rejoicing. So, we see it played out, right? And we see it played out in Acts.
Yeah, and I love that teaching on where I'm excited to get to it. I don't want to spoil it, but you probably forget by then, I hope. But I don't hope, but that might happen. But that teaching on worry is so powerful because it even will make a little bit more sense, which is she's chosen the good portion, or at least he says one thing is necessary, but he doesn't say what it is. It makes sense if it's the context of seek the kingdom first and these things will be added to you. And then he tells her, well, only one thing is necessary. Let me tell you what it is. There was basically a story of a man who didn't seek the kingdom first. This is what happened to him. Look at the birds. They seek the kingdom first. At least they trust in God and don't worry. So it's a great teaching on worry and anxiety of just like, and it's a lot harder than just trust God for your worries and anxiety. It's no, seek the kingdom to alleviate your worries and anxiety, because God's not going to help you fund your own kingdom. He's not going to, and God will provide these things for you if you seek the kingdom. And that may bother you, and hopefully won't bother you for too long before we're there, but it's God, things will be added to you if you seek the kingdom first. God's not going to fund your own kingdom bringing for yourself with you as the king or queen. And so that's a lot different as, I've been struggling with anxiety. Okay, what have you been seeking the kingdom first over your own kingdom? Because there's a lot of anxiety coming from seeking your own kingdom. But that's like in 3 or 4 weeks, so that's not tonight. Oh yeah, sorry, most important part. But the good portion is, there is a biblical case for what that means. It could just be God is your portion. Well, that may be true, and that is true. If I had to take the safest bet where no one would be mad at me, I would definitely say that. There's a different idea though in the writings of Jesus' time, which is the Torah is your portion. Studying the Torah is God's portion. And there is cases of so many different accounts of different prayers from Jesus' time of what to say when you're done studying Torah, and it's thanking God for giving him your portion for the day. Thank you for your good portion. And so that was very constant. And so that is radical that Mary has walked in and she's chosen the good portion, which is a man's role. That is a man's space, is to study Torah as the good portion. But he invites a woman into that, which was radical. And and that's why I want Jaina to say some things, because I don't have a woman's perspective. So you want to go?
Yeah. Okay, so he asked me for my women's perspective. I had to turn it to where I saw Carol, because Carol smiles at me and when I'm talking. So thank you for the encouragement. No, just have to see your face. I like seeing your faces. So he asked me for my women's perspective on this, which is kind of fun. So I sought out wise counsel from some women that I trust, and just kind of dialoguing about how do we balance this, because what Martha's doing is good, and we want to make sure our home is prepared and ready to receive people. And but there's the balance of, okay, are we distraught about it? Oh my goodness, do I have enough food? Like, is everybody going to think that my house is clean enough? And we have these anxieties that come alongside it. And it made me think of, I've never hosted a Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas dinner at our home. But it made me think of this Thanksgiving dinner. I'm sure you've all been to one where it's kind of chaotic, right. The food isn't ready, and whoever's cooking is really stressed about the food not being ready, and then dishes aren't done, and then you're worried about the dishes piling up, and don't actually sit and have that connection with someone that you haven't seen in a year, your family member that you have been missing for a long time, because you're worried about the dishes being done. And I fall guilty of that. We have college students that come to our home every week, and it is the highlight of our week. We love it so much. There are certain times where I will have had a long day of work or whatever, and I have neglected taking care of the house along the week. And so this time leading up to it is my heart's beating faster, and I'm oh my goodness, I have to clean all these random things that I've put off for a while. So anyway, I wanted to read Psalm 16, verses 5 through 11. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. I bless the Lord who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I shall not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my whole being rejoices. My flesh also dwells secure. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption. You make known to me the paths of life. In your presence there is fullness of joy. At your right hand there are pleasures forevermore. And so we've talked about this first part of Psalm 16, verse 5 and 6. The lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Indeed, I have a beautiful inheritance. This is your Nahala that we talked about during the parable of the sower, where you have your set inheritance. And it talks about the Lord being your chosen portion. And then at the end, it talks about in your presence, there is fullness of joy. So I was thinking of when I am serving, am I serving out of a heart of joy? Or am I serving out of a heart of duty? and appearance. Because for me, sometimes it's, okay, I want to make sure everybody thinks my house is together. I have good enough food. I have enough food for everybody. So I want to just like sit in that presence that Mary is sitting in, of choosing the Lord as your portion, studying the scriptures as your portion, being in the presence of God, because that's where there's fullness of joy. And I don't want to take away any from what Martha is doing. I think the reprimand comes in when she complains about it, which we see in Philippians 2 and 1 Peter 4, do everything without grumbling, offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. So I think that that's where the fault comes in, is, okay, this is what I am doing to bring the kingdom. Why isn't she doing it the same way? And so I think we can get that comparison thing of expecting others to bring the kingdom in the same way that we are. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of what I got.
There's other episodes of this too, right? Like in John 4, when Jesus tells the disciples, I have food to eat that you don't know anything about. So he, it's the same kind of thing. It's like, what are we gonna eat? What are they gonna eat? It's okay. It's all right.
Yeah. Or in Mark, where he heals 2 blind men. Oh no, sorry, he feeds 5,000 people. They get on a boat and they're like, who forgot to bring bread? We don't have bread. They're worrying and freaking out about not having food. And then they get off the boat. So Jesus heals a man who was blind, but heals him twice. He heals him and he partially saw, which, remember the Isaiah understanding of see. He sees, but he doesn't see. And he heals him again. He says, I see people that look like trees. So he does it again. He says, now I see. Remember, because the whole point is they see who Jesus is, but they don't get it. They don't get that he can provide bread for them when he wants. And so now they really see. So I love that understanding too. There's a good quote from the mission I want to read to you real quick. I thought was a good example. Talking about scripture, he says, turn it over and over because everything is in it, and reflect upon it and grow old and worn out in it, and do not leave it, for you have no better portion than this. I thought it was really, really good.
I appreciate Jaina's insights, and I want to pause if anybody's got any questions or observations. And that was a really awesome quote too. But I appreciate your realness, because that's where a lot of us are, right? That's where a lot of us are. Anybody have any questions or observations or thoughts?
Greg, another thing I tell my kids is to bloom where you're planted. And maybe if Martha had been more willing to serve joyfully and watch Mary sit at the feet of Jesus, maybe, she would have learned something from it, to be more open to where Mary's strength was. She knew where her strength was. I don't know. That was something I thought of.
Yeah, that's thanks. It's such a fascinating, because I put in my notes, I don't know that, did Martha actually do something wrong? And I'm struggling with that. I don't know that it was actually wrong, because she was practicing hospitality, which is exactly what Jesus.
That's why I have so much trouble with the stories, because
in the previous, and for lack
of the story before is how to practice hospitality to someone you hate, and the next story is almost like, well, not too much, unless it's the Son of God, Rabbi in flesh in front of you. Don't then it's like, it was so hard for me. But I thought about it for a long time today. It was stressing me out, which is ironic, because that's kind of the whole point. But it's like, it was driving me crazy. Is why was she being reprimanded for serving? She was not sinning. She was just serving. I mean, that in their writings, from the stuff I've been quoting, that was the biggest honor of their time. If you were a woman, because they ran the house in their culture, that was the biggest honor, was to host a rabbi and his disciples as a place, because they didn't take pay for teaching. They would take hospitality and food and a place to stay, though. But that was the biggest honor, was to have a rabbi in your home. And so in this sense of the biggest honor she could ever have, she gets reprimanded by the rabbi for serving. And that's kind of, and then I thought, like, that's kind of the point, is it's not something inherent, and this is my opinion, but it's not something inherently sinful that's going to keep you from joy in Christ, we would say. They wouldn't use that term then, but it's not something inherently sinful always. It may be something morally neutral. Which is the parable of the sower, is just the thorns. It's just the cares and worries of the world. That is what will choke you out. It's not just that you'll have some grievous giant sin plaguing your life and you'll be the seed that gets choked out and you're studying God's word or following Jesus, but it's something just time consuming and morally neutral. And which is more haunting because it's just creeps up on you, and that's kind of the point, I think, is it's not that she was inherently just doing something egregiously ugly or sinning. It was just there was something else taking priority. That was also a good thing, but she didn't, which is funny because the parable before is also about prioritizing and reordering what is important when it comes to commands. And this one's prioritizing, reordering what is important when it comes to following Jesus. And I don't know, that's where I struggle with, like, is there a connection there? And then it kind of breaks down even with the next one it seems almost like another disconnected.
Yeah. I'm intrigued that Jesus models something with Martha that it's an insight that I'm not 100% sure we're going to see with a lot of relationships, because they were friends too.
Yeah.
I mean, he stayed in their home. He was close to Mary and Martha, the whole Lazarus story, and it's just so intriguing to me. And I'm not trying to psychoanalyze it. It's really more of there are certain people in my life that I can speak more frankly to than others.
Yeah.
But in some ways I can speak more frankly to people that I actually love more deeply.
Yeah.
Because they trust me, and I trust that they're going to receive. So, there's some things we just don't know, and I don't want to read into the text, but I am intrigued by, there was a more intimate relationship here. These were Jesus' disciples, but they were also friends. So I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't want to make more of it than we should, but it is an interesting text. It's a very, very intriguing.
Well, it happens again in John 12 when she anoints his feet with Lazarus, because we know where they're at, and that's why you have to deal with the ordering and just deal with that. Some things are just in a different order, because in John we know this isn't Bethany from John, which is right near Jerusalem, but he's got a long way to go till he gets there to Jerusalem in Luke's account. So Luke doesn't say where it's at. And we know where Bethany is called the house of suffering. So when we know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, it was a leper colony. They were the miserable, the outcast, the marginalized, that Jesus came and stayed before he was going to be crucified. He came and stayed the night with them a few times. And then it's really cool. And I love that. And then and this is John, so I'm not spoiling anything, but then they anoint him for his burial, and both for his burial and as king in Bethany and that's kind of the whole point of the gospel, is the marginalized, the outcast, the lowly are the ones who recognize and anoint him. Yeah.
People wonder, like, why is it two sisters and a brother living together? Like, where's their parents?
Yeah.
Where's, who else? And so these people have obviously undergone some suffering of some kind.
Which also look at the narrative of, which is funny because a lot of things I read were like, we don't know how, Mary and Martha knew he was coming, were they friends before? It's like, he just sounded the 72 and says, go to all the towns and villages before, tell them I'm coming in to prepare. The Samaritan village rejects him. Then he tells a parable about a good Samaritan and how you should even love a Samaritan, even though they just rejected us back there and you wanted to burn them alive, which is what James and John wanted to do. Keeps walking, and then he comes to, then we know the road he would have taken, which is the Jerusalem or Jericho road. He would have gone the other way up it to Jerusalem, which goes by the Wadi Kelt to Bethany, and then which is right over the Mount of Olives. Over the Mount of Olives is the triumphal entry down to Jerusalem. So it's like, it's just cool. I'll try to find a picture next week of just like, we know where Jesus would have walked, because there's not really another option, but it's just, that's kind of the narrative of going to Jerusalem. So I really like that stuff. But
it's intriguing though, in the context of all of this, that you've got a man, a priest, a Levite, a Samaritan. Later on, we're going to see a friend. In the prayer teaching that goes on here in just a few minutes. But then you don't just have a village. So you've got all of this ambiguity, but then you've got Mary and Martha.
Yeah.
So there is something is different. There is Luke is saying, I'm put this here because I want you to see Jesus in, you see him in the synagogue, you see him in the wilderness, you see him on the mountain, you see him. I want you just to see him in somebody's home. And he is doing exactly what he told the 72 to do. That's a great point. Go in. It's kind of funny. He doesn't really. He probably does speak peace on the house, but then he doesn't. He's not very peaceful with Martha, at least. At least it depends on your definition of peace, I guess.
Yeah, I love that the travelogue narrative of just he sends out the 72 to prepare, and then kind of from here on out, there's a lot of meals with people.
Right.
There's
right.
Then the lost sheep, lost coin, lost son is all at a meal in which the Pharisees were present, and he's teaching them, and then Zacchaeus is there, and then he's it's so cool that the narrative is coming to fruition, and it's almost like a very hero-like journey of which is a very Moses thing, but the very hero-like journey of him on the way to bring his people like Moses to deliver them to the promised land, but also at the same time like Israel, but also at the same time, like Jeremiah going to Jerusalem to warn them of the coming destruction. But to focus on the Moses one, he's bringing his people to the promised land. On the way, he's fighting all these foes and having these encounters with the Pharisees, some of the Pharisees who want to, stump him and get him to do something wrong. And then, he fights the ultimate enemy. And it's just a very hero narrative of these highs and lows along the way to the ultimate, victory. It's very interesting to me.
That's cool. Yeah, that's really cool. You guys have any thoughts, questions? You guys have any other thoughts about this section?
I don't think so.
Our time is starting to get away from us here. It's got about 5 minutes, so we'll be able to, I'm sure, to give quite a bit of justice to the Lord's Prayer in 5 minutes.
Martha, her name Marta. Her name would have been Marta, and Miriam. Her name comes from Mara, which means, if you remember from Mara, yeah. What
is it, Ruth?
From the
Naomi's son.
Yeah, but it's before that, that is an allusion to before that, when they're in the wilderness and there's the bitter waters of Mara, and he throws the stick in it's teaching Moses a lesson about leadership, but it throws a stick in to make the water sweet. I just love that. So it means bitter or hard or strong, kind of strong in like a bitter coffee sense, not strong like strength, but strong in a bitter coffee sense. So I love that. And then the story very much shows that her bitterness which kind of makes it a little bit make more sense. Maybe it's not like she's beaten down by trying to provide for these people. It's more maybe she's just a bitter person and she needs to be, which I think, because isn't she the one who anoints him later?
Yeah, as there's some, it's one of the questions is which Mary is this, right?
Yeah,
so
that gets really
we don't really know, right, if it's the same, because like Mary Magdalene is mentioned in chapter 8. And so is it the same? Is it the same person? I some of you may know the answer to that question. I don't know that I know.
Because Mary would have been from Magdala, right? And this Mary would have been from Bethany.
Yeah, or at least lived there. Who knows?
Greg, I have to give Martha a little slack. I wrote a blog on her a few years ago, and one of the things I noticed about her was when Lazarus had died, she ran out to meet Jesus, and she told him that if he had been there, her brother would not have died. And Mary
she's a very pushy person.
Mary stayed there.
She's like, if you would have been here, she's basically like, you killed him.
He also said, "Lord, he stinketh." But anyway, King James Version. But I admired her because she ran out to greet and was crying or whatever with him. And Mary just stayed there in the house. So, I mean, she did have a lot of faith in him, because she said that if he would have come sooner, Lazarus wouldn't have died.
So it's almost a reversal, right? I mean, it's in that context, Martha is the one who goes to Jesus. That's interesting. In this instance, Mary does. So that maybe Martha did learn. I mean, I don't know. I don't want to read too much into it, but that's a really interesting observation. Thanks for sharing that.
Sure.
Good insight. I think it would be unwise to start this next section at 3 minutes to 8, and I really don't want to rush through this. And I think there's some great material here for us to look at. Why is Luke's version a little briefer than Matthew's, and what's going on there? And there's some great backstory here related to how the prayer ties to prayers that many of the disciples would have already been, if not all, I guess, would have been very, very familiar with, because of ties to additional scriptures and or teachings of other rabbis. So I'd like for us to get into that piece next week. We'll start there and continue our conversation, and really look forward to being together. But if you have time between now and next Wednesday, please study as much as you can on this next section, and we'll take a deep dive into the Lord's Prayer. And of course, as always, if you have any thoughts or any observations, please don't hesitate to email us or text us, and we'll be very happy to do our best to try to have a conversation about that. You guys have anything else before we wrap up tonight?
No, sorry, something fell from the roof, I think. But no, I just saw that. I didn't maybe emphasize it enough, but just that the idea that she's being invited to sit at Jesus' feet, it's just hard for that to hit us in the same way as it would have hit them. Because I think even in Martha's mind, it was froze. Oh, it's still going. Okay, sorry, computer froze for a second. It's hard for that to hit us in the same way, but I don't know what to even say of that, because I'm not a female, so I don't know how that hits you in a different way, but it's just, that just was cultural shattering for Jesus to do that, to bring women into that circle, into that, to that space, and to give them a ability to encourage them to learn and sit at the rabbi's feet was amazing. So I can't think of a comparison that would be as culturally shocking in our culture, but maybe one of you can. But just think about that for a bit, because I'm sure some of you have more wisdom. I know some of you have more wisdom than I do. So yeah, that's all.
Well, I'm intrigued that, in 8, there's clearly an entourage with women in the entourage.
Yeah.
To what degree that they obviously were within distance of his voice, but you're talking about something different. You're talking about status that was not afforded.
Yeah, I mean, it's like exactly. It's just status that was not normally given to women, and it was Jesus elevating to that, and then rebuking a different woman who contradicted that she should be in that space. It's I think she was very much trying to get Mary back into the kitchen, as it were, in the notes, but get her back in there and help bring her back to our space. And she says, no, she belongs here. And that's awesome. I mean, that's cool. Yeah. Which is setting us that time bomb beside, which will later be a problem in Paul's teaching in different cultures, but it's putting that time bomb beside, but we'll get to that later.
Okay. We will get to that later in our study.
study.
Hey, thanks for being here, everybody. We look forward to seeing you Sunday, either in person or hopefully via live stream. And if not, then we'll look forward to seeing you guys again next Wednesday night. We appreciate you all. Love you very much. Hope you have a great rest of the week. Bye.
Bye, Kelly. Bye, Stephen.
Bye, Mom.
Bye, Mom.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I just thought about like the comparison.